Hello, welcome to the Creative Track Audio and Sound Design tutorial. So I've imported the package linked in the GitHub. It contains two scenes, the audio demo, which is the scene that we're going to try to recreate today, as well as a tutorial scene, which is a scene without any sound. So if we press play and navigate around the scene, we notice that there isn't any sound, and we should actually let the environment sort of tell us what this world could sound like. So if I look closely, I notice that the grass is swaying. It seems that some of the leaves on the trees are also moving, which would indicate that maybe this soundscape is windy. And so the first thing we probably want to do is add some ambient audio to this scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go onto the player, and under the player there's going to be a game object called Ambient Audio, and I want to add an audio source. So what is an audio source? An audio source is essentially a component that allows you to assign an audio clip or track that will play a sound. So one thing we can do here is we want to assign the wind trees ambient audio clip to this audio source. Under output, we have a mixer group. And so for this project, we've already set up mixer groups. We can go to audio, window, audio, and then audio mixer. Then look at the audio mixers here. And so we have two of them. One is a primary or audio mixer with another audio mixer as a child called Ambience. If we look at the Ambience mixer, there are several other mixers, wind, birds, river, rune, footsteps. So the reason why we have mixers is that it makes it a lot easier to organize specific tracks of sound. So we can manipulate the volume, add effects to them, toggle between them in scripts. It makes audio management a lot easier. And so what we want to do is we want to go back to our ambient audio object, set the output to wind under the ambient mixer. We look at some of the effects here, the check mark. So this is mute. We can just silence the sound, bypass effects, right, that might be associated with an audio mixer group. Bypass reverb zones, we can leave that unchecked for now. Play on awake, so when the scene loads, we want the audio to immediately start playing. And then loop. So we probably want to check this so that the audio repeats. So if we press play, now we have wind. Okay, so if you look at the scene, you might notice that there are these runes here. So I would imagine that maybe these would emit some sort of maybe a different sound to indicate to the player that this is something special. Hey, maybe you should check this out, and it's different from the environment. So we already have set up these rune colliders. And so what these do is there's essentially a particle system so that it'll emit particles when playing. But first, we actually need to add an audio source to this. So I've attached the sound clip under the audio clip. I've set the output to the ambient mixer. And then I want to activate this game object so that when I enter play mode, it will emit particles. And so when I do that, notice how the sound is quite loud. No matter how far we are from the rune, it just sounds like it's very close to us, and so the volume doesn't increase or decrease depending on our distance and proximity to it. So if we stop and go to the audio source clips or audio source component, we can modify some of these settings to make it perhaps more realistic. One is the spatial blend, is whether the audio source is affected by existing in a 3D world space. So we can set this to 3D. And then we can set the volume roll off to linear. And then if we press play, we notice that if we get further out, the volume decreases or increases. So it might be difficult to determine that because the max distance is set to 500 in this setting. But if we lower this value, let's say 50. As we get closer on the y-axis, that indicates the volume. We get further, it becomes quieter. And so there are different settings that we can play with right here. One is the Doppler level. So if I increase the Doppler level, that will modify the pitch of the sound depending on my distance from it. So if you've heard an ambulance pass by while you're driving in a car, how the pitch changes, and essentially you experience the Doppler effect. That's essentially what the Doppler level does. And so these three sound settings only are affected if you enable the spatial blend to be completely 3D. If you set to 2D, it won't be activated. So we can stop here, and we can go to the second rune. So for the second rune, let's also enable it and add an audio source to it. Under the audio source, we'll assign the second rune clip, set the audio mixer group to the rune, and let's try a logarithmic roll-off here. And so looking at the curve, under 3, we also have to set the spatial blend to 3D. If we get close to it, notice how the sound scales not linearly, how it's barely audible here, but if we get closer to it, it becomes significantly louder. So logarithmic roll-off is essentially simulating a more realistic way that we listen to sounds and hear sounds in real life. And another thing we can do is actually modify the curves. So for example here, we can do a custom roll-off, so depending on what distance I am away from the rune, the audio listener will play at a specified volume. Alright, so let's stop that. So another thing I can do is I can look at these mixers here. And since I'm routing both these rune sounds through the audio mixer rune, I can press edit on play mode in the audio mixer window. And let's say I want to mute it, or let's say I want to mute the runes. I can just change the level here in the mixer. I can also boost it here, so on and so forth, and modify the levels. If I go into the parent, I can actually modify the entire group of mixers by just sliding this down like so to adjust the level. So let me just reset this. Okay, so one thing I should probably mention is that in order to hear sounds in your game scene, you need an audio listener. So an audio listener is essentially like your ears, and it determines where the audio should be received. If we don't have an audio listener in the scene, then you can't hear anything. There can only be one audio listener active at a time. You can have multiple audio listeners attached to different objects, but you can only have one active at a time. So I forgot to mention that. Okay, so for the third rune sound, what I can do is I can add an audio source. Let's activate this. let's set this to the third audio clip and also set the output to the ambient mixer. I'm going to use a custom roll-off and just modify it by dragging these points. So let's say we want it to not never play at a volume of 1. I can just drag this here. Let's make this a little bit closer. Okay, so I like this current setting, and so we can just press play. Set this to 3D. I'm going to set the volume to 2 point, just a little bit quieter, and then press play. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set the third rune sound, set the game object to active and add an audio source, set the audio clip to the third rune and set the output to the rune mixer. I'm going to turn the spatial blend to 3D. Let's set the volume, let's make this quieter. We'll use a custom roll off here. I can adjust the curves and then maybe make this 15, make this really, you have to be really close in order to hear it. Okay, so let's press play. So as we approach, we should be able to hear it right now. Oh, I forgot to do one thing. I forgot to set the sound to loop. So let me do that. So let me do that. Get closer. And now I can hear it. Okay, so for the fourth rune, let's add something a little bit different. We'll still use an audio source so it can emit sound. So let's find where it is. We'll set the audio clip to the fourth rune. We'll also set the mixer group to the rune mixer. We'll set this to 3D. Let's use a logarithmic roll-off here. We can add something different. We can add a audio reverb zone. So what is a audio reverb zone? So essentially it's an effect that modifies certain sound sources, audio sources in an area to simulate if you're in certain rooms or areas. So for example, if you were inside like a cathedral, for example, right, or a cave, it would obviously sound different than if you were outside. And so audio reverb zones are a good way to apply effects to a group of sounds in an area without having to apply that effect to all these individual sounds. And so I can set the reverb preset to, let's make this mountain. And so you can try experimenting with audio reverb zones. So as you see, even though we're really close to it, the reverb preset sort of applies a reverberation effect to the music that we're playing. So we can set this to like dizzy, alley, different reverb zones, which will affect how it's presented. So it can sound like more echoey or in like a closed space. Audio reverb zones are very convenient for that. Okay, so I'm going to turn the rune sounds down because they're quite loud right now under the audio mixer. Let's add some okay, so one thing I think is missing is some sort of So one thing we can add are bird chirping sounds to give the scene more life and to perhaps make it less obvious that we have a looping wind track that's playing. So what we can do is we can go under the ambient audio we can add another audio source. We'll call this, we'll assign the bird clip here, and we'll set this to loop, and we'll also set the output group to birds. So I've written a script called bird sound controller, and under this script we can assign this audio clip here, or audio source, to the sound. So how I can do that is just drag and drop this specific audio source onto this clip. One thing I can do in order to configure the bird sounds is to add this script called a bird sound controller, which is already written. I can modify a couple settings here. So fade time defines how long it'll take for the sound to fade in or fade out. We can define a minimum time off value as well as a maximum time off value, as well as a minimum time on value and a maximum time on value, as well as a minimum volume and max volume. And so essentially what's going to happen is that in random intervals of time, we'll fade in the sound of the birds chirping and then fade them out after a certain duration. And so the time in which the bird sound plays is randomized such that it sort of masks any predictable loop or pattern that the player can recognize. So if we press play, we can look at the mixer here and see that the bird sound is currently playing. And so if we wait for a bit, we notice how the timer causes the sound to fade out, and so now it's no longer playing. And then after the next event, the sound fades back in, and then we can hear it again. So that is how we can sort of add those sound effects to add more immersion to the player environment. So the last thing that we've set up here are the footsteps. So if I press play, you'll be able to hear that depending on whether I'm in the grass or on the path, it will play a different footstep sound. So how did I do this? So it involves a little bit of scripting. So let's first look at the check terrain script. So if we generally look at the terrain, the world space has specific textures, right, that are painted on the terrain. So what if we could actually detect whether the player was on a specific texture, if they were on the grass texture or the dirt texture, and then depending on which texture they were on, we play a certain sound. So in order to do that, we need to first define a function that will allow us to get the player's position relative to the position on the terrain game object. So in order to do that, I wrote this function right here. Essentially, it takes the transform, which are the x, y, z coordinates of the player, as well as a terrain object. So I can access the data that's contained in the terrain object, which will contain the terrain game object's x, y, z position. So I subtract that from the player position to get the relative coordinates, right, on the x, y plane for the terrain. And then I scale it according to how large our terrain map is. And so essentially what I've done is I've converted the world space coordinates, right, of the player to the XY 2D coordinates of the terrain map. So with that translation, I populate this array called cell mix. This array contains the textures of the splat map of the terrain data. So you might be wondering, what is a splat map? So a splat map is essentially a color-coded map. So it kind of looks like a heat map. And essentially each color represents a specific texture that is painted. And so what's really cool about splat maps is that you can have a combination of different colors. And that signifies the weighting of a particular texture on that position on a map. And so for this tutorial, we're just using two textures, right? It's either a dirt texture or grass texture, and we can just grab that index, right, that weighting in the splat map, and we store that to determine if we're on dirt or grass. And then if we look at the footstep controller, so which is under player, what I've essentially done is I've included references to the terrain and audio source, and essentially I've defined a function that will first get the position of the player, right, relative to the terrain map, and then I will, depending on what the texture is, I'll play a specific clip. So play one shot just plays one audio clip to a given audio source. And so we're just checking if we're on grass, then we'll play a grass clip. If we're on dirt, we'll play a dirt clip. So to prevent sort of repetition, add variation between the footstep sounds, it defined an array, as you can see in the editor, where I can put different footstep sounds for which material that I'm on. And so this function here, getClip, essentially tries to grab a random clip in that array and then play it. And then the last thing I need to do was I need to edit the player movement script. So since we didn't have an actual player with a rig and an animation, we don't need to sort of sync the footsteps to a particular animation. We're just sort of a floating camera. So I just defined a timer right here, and an event, time until the next footstep. And so essentially on every frame, we'll just check this timer, we'll check if we're grounded, and then we'll just play that footstep in a specific interval of time. And then we'll call the play footstep function the controller. And so yeah, if we press play to move around, that's how the footsteps work, right? And we can, change the level of the footsteps accordingly in the audio mixer if they're too loud, if you want to make them quieter. And that's about it. So feel free to experiment with some of the settings of the audio sources. Maybe you can try adding music. Maybe you can try adding a sound to the river. Just feel free to play around and let the environment sort of inform this soundscape that you want to create. If you have any questions, feel free to message any of the officers on Discord or refer to the walkthrough on the GitHub. Everything should be on there. And yeah, have fun and have a good rest of your day.